Great. So welcome everybody, welcome back. Remember, I'm Anushka. I'm one of your CatSig committee members, and I'm pleased to welcome you all back to our professional development webinar series. This is the last webinar in this series, although if you liked it, if you liked the format and the series, we might do another one. We've had quite a lot of engagement with this format. So today our speaker is Helen Jenkins, and Helen is a senior collection description librarian at the National Library. Helen is a serials and integrating resources specialist, and she's going to share with us today how the National Library of New Zealand catalogues websites. So I will pass it over to Helen.
Oh, thanks, Anushka. Okay, I hope everyone can hear me okay. Right, I'll just get my slideshow going and then I'll start in a second. Right, hopefully that is working okay. All right, so as Anushka said, I'm Helen Jenkins. I'm a senior collection description librarian in the serials cataloguing team at the National Library. So I'll just give you a brief sort of overview of what I'm going to talk about today. So I want to start with a bit of background. I'm going to touch briefly on the Te Puna web directory, and then look also briefly at a little bit about web archiving at the National Library. Somebody might just need to mute there. I can hear a bit of background noise if you wouldn't mind. Thank you. Yes, that's better. And then I'll move on to looking at how we get catalogue websites at LNZ. So who does it, what we do, how a bit about the sort of local policies that we've come up with to deal with sort of particular situations, and a few notes around sort of the sort of points of difference that differences between websites as opposed to cataloguing other types of resources. And then I'll finish up with a look at how to find our catalogue records for websites and what you can do with them. So as I said, I'll touch first briefly on the Te Puna web directory. So this was a directory of internet accessible resources around New Zealand, on New Zealand and the Pacific. We launched it in 2000 and was retired in 2016, and it was based on something called Aranui that was initially built up and maintained by Lincoln University. But the reason I wanted to mention it was because it was derived from, the content was derived from bibliographic records that we created on our catalogue. So I think probably our first or one of the earliest sort of forays into website cataloguing. The sites in Te Puna web directory initially weren't necessarily archived, but over time a lot of them would have wound up in our archive, and so those initial web directory records were then developed into full records and still are kind of with us as the basis of those later web records. And the records for that Te Puna web directory records are still available, even though the site's been retired, as a data set via our website. You can get them in MARC or MARC XML. That's any records that were in the directory at the time it was retired in 2016. So those web directory records were minimal level records, so fairly basic, and we would put subject category codes in them. The subject hierarchy, each subject had a particular number, and we would put the number in local subject fields, and that controlled where what subjects they appeared under in the directory. They all had a summary note, and that was used as part of the directory listing when you got to the directory. And the summary notes were translated into Maori as well if the site had Maori content. So there'd be English and Maori summary notes for some of the sites. And then they would all have a particular holding once they were completed, and that was used to pull the records out and update the entries in the directory. So I'll just give you a quick look at what it used to look like for users. So the screenshot on the left gives you an idea of I talked about the subject hierarchy. So each of those subjects would have its own number, 140 or 78 or whatever it might be, and that would be in our bib record, and that would link them up and make sure they appeared under a particular subject. And then the section on the right is what the listings, if you went into a particular topic, you get a listing of websites on that topic. And the red link with the URL in it would be derived from the text in the 245 field, so the title proper and the other title information. And the summary note, I mentioned they had to have summary notes, and the summary note would be pulled out, and that would be that explanatory blue text underneath the link to sort of say what the site was about. Okay. So just moving on to just give you a little brief overview of web archiving at the National Library. So we have got a web archiving team in the Alexander Turnbull Library, and they selectively archive websites about New Zealand, about New Zealanders and the Pacific. And they all go into the New Zealand Web Archive, which is comprised of, I think, over 5,500 unique website titles and counting, and over 33.5 web instances, because each website will be harvested more than once. They're generally collected, harvested at regular intervals, I think, depending on the type of content, how regular, how often they're updated, things like that. And the collections, the collection strengths, the strengths of the collection include things, websites by and for Maori, music, arts and culture, environment, and so on. As well as the selective web archiving, we also have teams working on, they do a whole of domain web harvest each year. That's a snapshot, they send a crawler out round and take a snapshot of the .nz domain at the time of the harvest. Started doing that in 2008, and it's been, as I say, it's happening annually now since 2015. And to give you an idea of the amount of data we're dealing with, the 2015 harvest pulled out 200 million URLs and 15 terabytes of compressed data. So there is a lot of data there. And as well as websites, obviously there's a lot of content now that doesn't touch the website side of things, and that is only available via social media. So we've got the Turnbull have got the team down there doing things like Twitter harvesting, so they will go and run crawls of Twitter for particular hashtags around particular events, so COVID or the election or Kaikoura earthquakes or whatever, go and run crawls of pull all tweets including that hashtag and archive those. And they've also been running a project where they're working on getting Facebook archives, so educating people around how they can extract their Facebook content from Facebook, and then asking some of them to consider donating that to the Turnbull Library, just to sort of fill that gap in the record. And you can contribute to the web archive as well if you happen to come across a website out there that you think we should have that we don't currently archive. There's a nomination form on our website. If you go onto our site, I think just search web archive nomination, and that will get you to the form, and do let us know, because it's always good to have other people out there looking for these things. All right, so moving on to looking at cataloguing websites at the National Library. So who catalogues websites here? It's not any great surprise, it's the Xerox cataloguing team, the team that I'm part of. So we deal with all continuing resources. So that includes integrating resources like websites and print loose leaf type publications, print integrating resources, and serials, so newsletters, magazines, annuals, monographic series. We create serial records for monographic series, serial records and individual monographic records for each issue within. So that we cover all of those. As far as the standards that we follow, so RDA, we use the RDA toolkit, and that's sort of as modified by our attributes policy, the NLNZ attributes policy. That's available in your toolkit via the tools tab. You go down tools tab and down to workflows, and there's a websites map as well, which is available also on the tools tab and down in the maps area. We also use Consult Concur. Module 35 of the Concur cataloguing manual covers the cataloguing of integrating resources, and that gives us a lot of detail that RDA doesn't necessarily flesh out, more examples and explanation. I should point out we're not a Concur library, but we are guided by the Concur standards when we're cataloguing serials and integrating resources. So the type of work that we do on websites. So we're creating, first of all, records from scratch for sites that the web archiving team have identified and archived. And then also a lot of work around changes. I understand there's a lot of change out there to websites. So any websites that have gone offline or have changed in some way, we will go in and update or cease those records. So most common changes are things like titles, corporate body changes, the URLs change a lot, or often a combination of any or all of these. So I thought now I would just pick out some of the sort of local policies that we come up with to deal with sort of scenarios that occur a lot. So the first one is around if we don't have access to a live website. So normally we'd catalogue a site from the current iteration. So for websites, that means the live website. But sometimes that's not available. It could be that the site went offline shortly after it was archived, or another situation is where we know a change has happened between the last issue, the last version that we described, and the current version, but that's not reflected in the live version, but is in an archived iteration somewhere or other. So we want to reflect that in the record. So in this situation, we can use this note to sort of say that we're working on an archived copy, not the live one. So we say title from homepage of archived copy of site, and specify the version harvested, because as I mentioned before, sites are very often will be harvested more than once. So we need to be clear about which version we're looking at when we're taking that information. Another policy is around the cataloguing of websites on the websites of festivals and conferences and such like. So RDA makes provision for an exclusion if you're cataloguing a serial or a multi-part monograph that's got a date or a number or whatever in the title, that you can exclude that from the title proper, but it doesn't extend that to integrating resources. So we have done that in our attributes policy and said that if we're cataloguing a website of an ongoing festival or conference, so not for one-offs, but for something that we think is ongoing, that we will exclude that date from the title. So as an example, this one here is the Costello Music Festival. So as you can see in the title proper and the 245, we've omitted the year from there. And we've also made provision in our policy that in this situation only, we'll add a description based on note with that date. So that is, I think, the only situation where you would see a description based on component to that title from note for a website. Okay. So I think I talked briefly about the nature of websites and how they're always changing. So sites often will disappear offline and no longer be available. So if a site, if it's no longer available at all and it doesn't redirect to another site, we will note that in the 856 field. So we'll add this wording to the end of the note field to say that the electronic address is not available when searched on a particular date. And it covers us, if it does perhaps come online again in the future, well, it certainly wasn't available at the time that we described it. However, if the site isn't dead, but if it redirects to another location, the process is slightly different. So until recently, if we had a change in a URL, we would remove the old URL and put in the new one. But the Turnbull Web Archiving team asked us for a way of recording these former URLs in the record because they wanted to be able to more easily search them. So what we came up with was that we would move the former URL into the note, the Z subfield of an additional 856 field, and add the date viewed to record them. So I'll show you what that looks like. So this one, this is a website called Cycle the Big Easy Hawke's Bay Trails, and initially when it was catalogued first in 2014, the URL was bigeasy.co.nz, and then in 2019 we went in to update the record because the URL had changed. It had moved to this other one under hawkesbaynz.com. So what we've done to show the former URL is to add in this extra 856 with the text former URL the old URL goes in there, and then this date at the end here is the date viewed as it was at the time when we described it with that earlier URL. And then of course the title from note is updated with that later date of description. Okay, another quirk of websites is that often the websites that we're describing cover, a particular organisation or person, and so you wind up with a title that is exactly the same as the name of that person or corporate body or whatever it might be. So we're often needing to add authorised access points to distinguish the title of the website from that body. So this is a excuse me, just right. Apologies. So this is under RDA 6.27.1.9, which is where it talks about adding what we can add to access points to distinguish works from agents, places, other works. So this one is Biotech, the website of Biotech New Zealand. So that goes in the 245, and then we add an authorised access point in the 130 field, qualified by website. So another little quirk of websites is you'll get these extra variant titles that pop up out of the HTML code that will not necessarily correspond with the title as it appears on the website. So we cover those off by showing it in a 246 with this text HTML header title. So this one is, I think, the variant title of the Taupo Tourism Love Taupo site. So there's that one. So I guess probably the big thing about the difference between cataloguing websites as opposed to cataloguing serials, which is where I started out, was that title changes, generally speaking, don't require us to create a new description. So most of the time, if we've got a title change, we update the record to show the current title in the 245 field, and the earlier title moves down to a 247 field. So I'll show you what this looks like. So this is a little snapshot of the New Zealand Music Foundation's website, and we first catalogued this in April 2012. And this is as a note, just so that you can see if you've catalogued under AACR2, you can see this is an AACR2 record. It's got the GMD, the General Material Designation that we would used to put for anything that wasn't text. So electronic resource was the one for online stuff, websites and things. And then AACR2 would allow us to add a qualifier in square brackets if you had a title proper that comprised only the title, a name, the name of a body or a person. Whereas now, I talked earlier about the authorised access point qualified by website sort of kind of covers the same sort of ground under RDA. So yeah, so this was the website as it was in 2012. And then by 2019, the foundation had changed its name to Music Helps Awhina Poro. So we need to we've updated the record to show the new title proper. Awhina Poro has gone into the parallel title, gone into this parallel title. And then that old title proper, New Zealand Music Foundation, has moved down into a 247 field. And again, we've shown that this is the title as it was when we described it back in 2012. That's the date viewed as it appeared on that earlier iteration, and the title from note is updated with the current date. On the note of change, variant titles, of course, often pop in and out and reappear and disappear. So, but if there's one that's dropped off the current site, but we do think they're still of use as a variant title, we can add them. Or rather, we can leave them on the record and just note that that they appeared at this time when in this case May 2010. That was there when we made that description, but it's no longer there. But we'll leave it because it's of use in terms of locating the record. So I talked about earlier about title changes for websites often not requiring a new description, but there are some situations where we would, although they're fairly rare. RDA isn't desperately helpful here in that it gives 4 scenarios where you would need to create a new description for an integrating resource. 2 would be very uncommon for a website. One is a change in mode of issuance, and the other is a change in media type, which could happen, but fairly uncommon. The third is talks about the rebasing of an integrating resource and new sets of base volumes. So that's really aimed at print integrating resources. And then the fourth one is talks about a change in addition statement. So it says a change in addition statement indicating a significant change to the scope or coverage of an integrating resource. So while we don't tend to get an explicit addition statement on a website, we will sort of take the spirit of that in terms of whether we're going to look at creating a new description, starting a new record. The other scenario where we would look at having two set, not continuing on the existing record is something that comes up where the publisher of a website moves the content onto another of their websites. So generally speaking, in that scenario, we would just close off that old record and note the relationship between that old one and the one that it's been absorbed into. And that is sort of a local decision. I'll cover that when I get to the next slide, but that's what we do with them. So as an example of a sort of drastic scope change, this is the website, the RENA project website, and it began live documenting that project, which was cleaning up the Astrolabe Reef after the grounding of the ship RENA. And we first archived this in 2013. I think this screenshot's from a version archived in about 2015. However, so yes, it was renaproject.co.nz, but in about 2016, that URL started redirecting to this one, astrolabereef.co.nz. And this site focuses basically on boating and diving around the reef. Wildlife, I think, a little bit as well. And the RENA project content has largely vanished, or had largely vanished. So in this case, because this was such a massive change in scope, we actually created a new record for the Astrolabe Reef site. And as I say, that's sort of in the spirit of that RDA rule around the change, a change in the addition statement of an integrating resource and needing a new description. So this is an example of the scenario I talked about where a publisher has multiple websites and moves the content from one into another. So this site was Every Child is Worth It, which was set up by the NZEI, the New Zealand Educational Institute, as part of their campaign for better funding for early childhood education. And this is the site as archived in November 2017. However, when we got by sort of 2018, that URL was then redirecting to the campaign section of their main website, of the main NZEI website. And this was already being archived separately and had its own catalogue record. So we, in this scenario, we closed off the record for the Every Child is Worth It site and gave showed that the relationship was that it had been absorbed by the main site. It would be possible, you could make a local decision to perhaps archive that section. If you decide, if you wanted to, you could archive that section separately and create a separate record. But for us, because as I say, we already had the record for the overall NZEI website, we would just treat it as an absorbed situation. So I'll show you what that looked like in terms of the MARC record. So this is the site for the Every Child is Worth It site. We closed it off as having ceased in 2018 because that's when it stopped, it ceased to be available as a separate thing, and showed that it was continued absorbed by the NZEI site and using the 785 field. And also note the use of the former URL setup, because of course this URL, it doesn't take you to the resource any longer, it's taking you somewhere else. And then on the record for the main website, the NZEI website, we've got showing the relationship back the other way to show that it absorbed this other site. And because we know it happened sometime in 2018, we put that in there in angle brackets to show that's roughly when it happened. So publisher changes for websites, not vastly different from what we would do for a serial, and apart from we obviously don't have can't show particular issue numbers or issue dates or whatever in the dates field. So instead we'd use the date, our date viewed. So this particular one, this Wānui Amata website, when we initially described it, had no publisher identified at all. And then when we've updated it, we've gone back and updated it in 2019. And they're now showing a publisher. So we've added that in. And as I say, these are the date viewed, and this is the title from note showing this is the most recent date that we've reviewed it and updated the description. Extent, this is fairly straightforward, I suppose, but RDA at base would have us use the karyotype online resource here, but it also gives an alternative where you can use various terms in common usage if there's nothing appropriate or nothing that you want to use at that listing of karyotypes back at RDA 3.3.1.3. So yeah, we've covered that in our attributes policy and said that we will use various terms, and for these we would use website as the extent. We also add local notes to all our website records, so archived by the National Library of New Zealand. Well, that's not just websites, that's all I think most of our digital stuff, but then also this other note around the limitations of the archive copy, so that the links may not work, just advising users the links may not work from within the website, URLs that you click on within may not go anywhere, and that some of the content may not have been archived. Various technical reasons. Summary notes, we don't generally add these, but you will see many existing records have them because as I said, those Te Web Directory records were required to have them, and there are a number of those out sort of living on as full catalogue records for archive websites. And those summary notes were translated to Māori as well. So some of those old Te ex-Te records also have Māori summary notes. Although we don't add them, we will update the summary notes if they become out of date in some way. So the title changes or issuing body changes or content drops off. So in this instance, this is the summary note for the website of Engineering New Zealand, who are formerly IPENS. And an earlier iteration that was described, obviously there was enough Christchurch earthquake information on the site that we brought that out in the summary note, and that is no longer there or no longer enough substance to necessarily merit mentioning it, especially now. But we will bring that out in the note just to show that there are older issues that did have that substantial amount of information, because that would be useful to users to know that that's there. So subject cataloguing for websites, probably not too different to subject cataloguing for serials. You've got to have headings that are broad enough to cover off the ongoing content of the resource, and you may need to keep an eye on them and update them if the subject matter changes. The corporate body changes is probably the most common one there that we would need to change. But it's just the point of difference is that because the nature of what we collect and the speed at which it can happen is that we're sometimes cataloguing sites on breaking news topics before any other types of resource have made it into the library. So, for example, the Christchurch mosque shootings or COVID-19, we were probably one of the first to be describing material on those topics, and they didn't have subject heading, either didn't have subject headings or we hadn't sort of really established subject heading practice around those. So, but fortunately we have a authority control team here at the library that are able to help us out and figure out what to do in these situations until the subject headings or the practice catches up. Right, so what I wanted to do now is to look at how you can find, first of all, how you can find records for our websites in our catalogue. So I will hopefully be able to screen share that with you, but if that doesn't work, I have some screenshots that I can work through. So I'll just switch over to my web browser. Excuse me a second. Apologies for the delay here. I'll be with you shortly. All right, so hopefully you can see that's our National Library catalogue. If someone could just give me a thumbs up that's working okay. Cool, thank you. Okay, so to find our websites, records for our websites in our catalogue, so you need to type in a search topic. So I'll go with music, just as an example. Okay, and then down the side here, we can filter by resource type, and websites are a resource that we can filter by. So, and then that will give you a list. That's all our catalogue, should be all our catalogue records for websites that include the word music. So if I go and look at our friend Costellar Music Festival here. So we've got sort of the basics of the record at the top. And then if we scroll down the page, you can see here the various archived iterations of the website. So I mentioned how websites are harvested on an ongoing basis. Oops, that one's got a little carried away. But yeah, so this has been archived starting in 2016 and still is as of April this year. So you'd then be able to open up the copies of the website, and then the rest of the catalogue record appears down the bottom. Okay. So the other thing I wanted to talk about is that, as well as accessing our website records via our catalogue, you can actually download them yourself to your own catalogues. So you can do this via Tapuna Records site. I've got a link to this in my slideshow, which I think will probably be available afterwards. So this makes available bibliographic records for all our open access digital items. So anything that's freely available and that can be accessed by the public. So if you go to the site, there's downloads for each month's catalogue records. So for example, and websites happily are in their own file, so you can download a file of MARC records for all the websites catalogued in September 2020. And if you put them into your catalogue, as I say, they will have links within them that will take you to the actual resource in the National Digital Heritage Archive, the NDHA, for your users to access. If you wanted, this sort of gives you all the records for a particular month. If you wanted a specific record for a specific website, of course, our records are also on WorldCat, so you can access them from there as well. And I think that is about the end of my talk. So I guess we get to the stage now where I ask if anyone's got any questions. Okay. Just need to figure out how I can see the chat. Right, okay. I guess, yeah, if you've got any questions, pop them in the chat. I've got my email address there if you think of anything afterwards that you'd like to ask that you didn't think of it. Okay, so I've got a question. How do you keep up with the huge number of new websites out there? It's probably more a problem for the Toombul team working on web archiving. I imagine they have various means of keeping across things, but certainly they would have, you know, ways of keeping up with new material. And, you know, as I said, there's forms for people outside the library to nominate, but also within the library. You know, if we came across a new site or something that had changed while we were in the process of cataloguing something, for example, we would let them know. The acquisitions and legal deposit staff also, if they came across something that was in the, you know, the website basket, they would let them know. So it's a bit of a team effort, but yeah, I imagine they have their ways of keeping across material as well as they can. Okay, so the question about how often are the links for the websites checked? Again, that's I think possibly more of a question for the Toombul team, but certainly they would certainly be checked at the time that they have a regular schedule as to how often a particular website is archived, and they would be obviously checking them before they go and harvest the new iteration. I'm not sure if they run I'm actually not sure if they run link checkers outside of that, I'm afraid. There's a question about what about sites like YouTube? My understanding is that we are able to archive websites that are within the New Zealand, the .nz domain. Overseas material is a different kettle of fish, and that I believe requires talking between our teams here and the people at those sorts of sites. I think there has been some communication. I'm not sure about YouTube. I know there's been some back and forth with sites like Bandcamp and things like that around, you know, New Zealand content that is based on those overseas sites, but that's not my area, I'm afraid.
That looks like all the questions we've had so far for Helen. Okay, well, I'd like to say on behalf of everyone here, thank you very much for your very informative presentation. I really enjoyed that. Oh, yep, and we've got some people coming in thanking you now. And yes, the slides will be up. The material from Describe NZ is being transferred onto the Leanza website next week. Once that's all up, we will put up the slides for this presentation. Also, as soon as the Leanza has finished sorting out all the recording for today's session, we will be sending out, someone will be sending out a link to all the recordings so you can go back and listen to them. So thank you very much, everyone. This has been very successful. Very good to know that CatSig Talks has actually managed to attract people along, because we weren't sure whether how this format was going to work, so that's good. We will be sending out a survey shortly to get any other feedback and opinions that you have. It would be great to know if you want us to run some more of these, or if you want the format slightly changed or something. Any comments would be greatly appreciated, just so we know what we need to look at for next year. And thank you very much to all our different presenters.